You assume ancient people were too busy surviving to fall in love. Yet 6,000 years ago, two lovers were buried together, holding hands. You picture ancient marriage as a love story waiting to happen. Now here's where it gets interesting. Marriage and love barely touched throughout history. Marriage settled land, debt, and family alliance between strangers. Love, when it existed, stayed separate, happening alongside the arrangement, or sometimes never happening at all. That one distinction changes how you should read every ancient love story ahead. The poems, the myths, the secret notes passed inside temples and courts. Keep that as we travel from prehistoric caves to medieval courts, since the ancient world had dozens of answers to the question you're asking. Most people assume the opposite of what's coming, that cavemen only grunted and pointed. Let's start at the beginning, in the world before written words. Courtship in early human groups often happened through shared work, a successful hunt, a fire tended through the night, a gift signaling you could provide. Pair bonds mattered for survival itself, since a child raised by two committed adults stood a better chance against hunger, cold, and general cruelty. But that's not the wild part. Archaeologists in Italy uncovered two skeletons from 6,000 years ago, buried face to face, arms wrapped together. In ancient Mesopotamia, matchmakers arranged unions for families, and dowries were carefully recorded on clay tablets, treating marriage as a documented legal transaction. Priests believed a sacred marriage right between a king and a priestess, standing in for a goddess, could guarantee fertility for the land itself. Here's the detail nobody expects. The oldest love poem ever discovered, written on clay nearly 4,000 years old, was composed for one ritual night. Turns out the truth is even stranger. Young Egyptians courted quite openly, trading flowers, perfume, and small trinkets outside any formal marriage plan. Lovers called each other brother and sister as terms of deep affection, regardless of actual family ties, a custom confusing modern readers of old letters. Surviving papyrus poems describe lovesickness as a literal physical illness, one that apparently required a physician's visit, treated as a genuine medical symptom. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Greek marriages among citizens were arranged for property and alliance, decided by fathers before any wedding. The Greeks split love into distinct categories, naming passionate eros, loyal philia, and selfless agape, believing each served a different purpose in life. Yet the poet Sappho wrote of her heart racing, and her voice failing at the mere sight of someone she quietly loved from afar. Here's what actually happened next. Roman marriage worked as a legal and financial contract, arranged by family heads to secure property and alliances. Romans generally viewed intense romantic passion as unnecessary within marriage itself, sometimes even improper, better suited to poetry than a respectable household. The poet Catullus wrote scandalous, obsessive verses about his affair with a married woman he nicknamed Lesbia, publishing his heartbreak for Rome to judge. Now consider what this really meant. In ancient China, matchmakers negotiated matches based on family status, birth horoscopes, and social standing, not the couple. One popular myth told of a weaving girl and a cowherd, separated by the Milky Way, allowed one reunion each year on a magpie bridge. People believed in an invisible red thread, tied by fate around the ankles of two future partners, guaranteeing they would eventually meet regardless. But there's a catch. Arranged marriage was common across ancient India, yet old texts describe Swayamvara ceremonies, where a woman chose her own husband. Epic poems frame these selections as tests of strength or skill, letting fate and ability decide the match, not family negotiation alone. The Kama Sutra, often reduced today to a sex manual, actually devotes chapters to conversation, subtle gestures, and reading the early signs of affection. This is where the story splits. Aztec and Maya marriages were typically arranged through matchmakers, negotiating for both families over weeks or months. Certain ceremonies bound couples quite literally, physically tying the groom's cloak to the bride's blouse, a knot meant to represent their new union. Couples in some Maya communities exchanged small carved jade or obsidian tokens, believed to carry protective power over the relationship ahead. Somewhere along the way, someone figured this out. Norse courtship happened at large public assemblies, where families negotiated matches while women kept real say. Gift-giving of jewelry or fine weapons was treated as a serious, almost binding signal of intent, functioning as a public announcement of plans. Norse women could legally divorce a husband simply by declaring it publicly in front of witnesses, a level of independence unusual for the era. And once you know this, everything else makes more sense. Some Celtic couples entered handfasting, a trial partnership lasting a year and a day. If that trial year ultimately failed, both partners could simply walk away freely, with remarkably little social shame compared to later European customs. Celtic bards were literally paid to compose personalized love poetry on commission, meaning affection itself could be purchased, written to order, performed aloud. Imagine this. Noble marriages across medieval Europe were arranged almost entirely for land and power, couples sometimes meeting only days before their wedding. Courtly love developed as its own separate tradition, celebrating passionate devotion that was, quite deliberately, aimed at someone who wasn't your actual spouse. Traveling troubadours performed elaborate love songs where the entire point was aching, unresolved longing for someone unreachable, never a tidy, happy ending. Across many West African traditions, courtship involved bride price negotiations, with gifts of livestock or goods exchanged as a sign of respect. Courtship dances and praise poetry let suitors publicly display devotion, wit, and standing in front of a whole watching community as public performance. Among some Yoruba communities, a suitor's hired praise singer could improvise poems on the spot, naming a woman's beauty, lineage, and family reputation. Think about surviving that scrutiny. In the Heian court of ancient Japan, courtship often began through poetry exchanged behind screens, faces hidden away. Handwriting itself was judged as a genuine measure of character and taste, meaning a beautifully brushed poem could make someone fall for penmanship alone. Some courtships lasted months as a slow exchange of poems, with an actual face-to-face meeting sometimes only happening after marriage was already decided. In parts of ancient Polynesia, courtship included public singing and dance competitions, letting suitors display charm, humor, rhythm, and skill before the village. Certain songs were composed specifically to flatter one particular person, and a clever enough verse could shift an entire community's opinion of a match. Tattoos in some island cultures marked more than status alone, visibly recording romantic milestones directly on the skin for the community to read. But that was not easy for outsiders to notice at first. In ancient Persia, poetry became the language of courtship, wrapped in gardens and wine. Persian poets treated the beloved almost like a divine figure, blurring devotion to a person with devotion to the divine within the same verse. Some Persian love poems were so deliberately ambiguous that scholars still argue whether a poem describes a human lover or a spiritual one. In the ancient Levant, one surviving text stands apart, a collection of frank, sensory love poems eventually preserved inside a larger religious scripture. That collection, the Song of Songs, describes longing, bodies, gardens, and desire so openly that scholars spent centuries arguing over its interpretation. Unlike almost everything else preserved from that region, the poem never once mentions law, duty, children, or property, only wanting someone plainly. In the Inca Empire, most commoners chose their own partners fairly freely, while nobility faced far stricter matches decided above their own heads. Communities sometimes held trial periods before a formal wedding, letting a couple live together briefly to test compatibility before families fully committed. Certain textiles were woven specifically as courtship gifts, particular patterns believed to carry meaning about devotion, status, and a suitor's serious intentions. Among several Native American nations, courtship customs varied enormously, but many included a suitor playing a courting flute outside the home he loved. In some nations, women held real power over courtship and marriage decisions, including ending a marriage simply by setting a man's belongings outside. Gift exchanges, often horses, blankets, or crafted goods, served as visible proof of a suitor's seriousness, weighed almost as carefully as the person. Now step back and look at everything we've just walked through. Stop after stop, culture after culture, continent after continent all at once. In nearly every one of those places, marriage itself was arranged by someone else entirely, by parents, matchmakers, or priests, never the couple alone. And yet love poetry, secret letters, aching songs, and quiet longing appear again and again in nearly every culture we've visited, everywhere at once. Which raises a question modern viewers almost never stop to ask about their own supposedly timeless assumptions surrounding love, marriage, and how they fit. Now here's the twist most people never hear. The idea you should marry the person you actually love is astonishingly recent, barely centuries old. For most of human history, across most places on Earth, romantic love and marriage were treated as separate systems that only occasionally overlapped. Historians point to shifts in Western Europe and America only a few hundred years ago, as the moment marrying for love became an expectation. Even today, across large parts of the world, arranged marriage remains completely ordinary, meaning your own assumption is a fairly recent cultural experiment. So maybe the real surprise isn't that ancient people never experienced romantic love, because they clearly did, in poem after poem, culture after culture. The real surprise is how rarely, across almost all of human history, anyone actually expected love and marriage to be the very same thing. So next time you picture two ancient people, remember those two skeletons in Italy, still holding hands after 6,000 years, loving before we asked.